What I'd like to do now is to take questions from the audience, and then maybe just a few minutes before we close, I'll give each of the panelists a few minutes, if you wish, to make requests of what the audience should do or make requests of what each other should do, and so that we have a very clear idea of what the next steps could be taken in this arena. Now, are there mics? There are mics for questions. So there's one here, and another microphone is coming. Peter Shane right here, and there's another mic over here. If there's anybody over here that's got a question, great.
Is this on? I guess it's on.
Yes.
I'm Peter Shane from Ohio State. On a problem, first of all, I thought this was a spectacular panel, and I sat here wondering in how many countries there would be a representative of what every other country would call the Ministry of Defense, arguing for the more proactive disclosure of information. I mean, we've got to feel somewhat good about this, the state of affairs. But on a big problem like the one that we face, there's always a temptation to identify, the root of the problem being something so fundamental that you walk away thinking, well, if that's the problem, then real progress is impossible. And when we talk about culture change, I mean, that sounds like, well, if that's what we need, how's that ever going to happen? I guess my question is, how much of the need for culture change really is just a matter of resources? That is, if agencies were actually given budgets adequate to deal with the information management issues that are posed, and if the mission side of the agencies actually had enough staff so that they weren't afraid that every disclosure of information was going to yield enormous demands on their time just to explain the information, that would detract from the need to accomplish other mission-relevant things. I wonder whether those things by themselves wouldn't have an enormous impact on what looks like a culture, but is mainly just people absolutely strapped for time and money.
Could I
Go ahead.
start with that? Peter, you've asked several very difficult questions, and maybe one way to sort of talk about resources is to look at the context here. The numbers fluctuate a little bit, but over the last several years, the government typically in 1 year, across the government, we now have 97 departments and agencies. And of course, if you break those departments and agencies down, particularly the big departments, into components, you're really talking more like 350 agencies. They get collectively somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 requests in 1 year. The numbers in terms of the administrative cost as well as litigation cost typically in the last several years are a little over $333 billion, which is still a lot of money. But I think Will would agree with me. I don't think there are very many agencies that would ever say they have had adequate resources really to do their FOIA program right. In fact, in most agencies, it's not even a line item budget. It really is something that is just absorbed. There are no specific appropriations typically for that. So there have never really been adequate resources. But we are not going to be getting more resources. That's absolutely clear. So I think we are really faced with a true crisis here of learning how to work better. So I know that this is something that Will deals with every single day probably, with how to do better with less. But one thing that we can do in terms of culture change within agencies ourselves is have people actually start talking to each other. One thing that we have found is very often the case. The FOIA people never really talk to the IT people, and they never really talk to the people who do the discovery, and they never talk to, unless there's litigation, the people in the counsel's office, at least on a regular basis, and really approach this in a team fashion. So working better in teams and working to do a lot better job of building openness into the process. For example, requiring that information collection does have an openness disclosure piece of it, could really save money and would be one way to start, but it's going to take time. It really is culture change.
Well, I can, to break down a little bit of your question, if spending the $92 million that we spent, that's what we have to spend to respond legally to the Freedom of Information Act requests that we're getting. And as has been well noted, we don't always meet the 20-day time limit given.
Although you guys are closer than most.
even given that amount of money that we spend. I would say that if the FOIA keeps at its current pace, along with all the other requests for information that we get, whether they come from the public or whether they come from internally within the government, if you're going to get a more of a proactive release, all of the proactive releases will be in addition to what's going on with the Freedom of Information Act right now. So maybe of that $92 million, you have to say, well, can some of that money be diverted, perhaps, from FOIA requests, or having to respond legally to these requests towards more of a proactive disclosure? Because as Miriam said, there's not any more money coming.
Oh, you want to go ahead? All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I think about when we talk about changing culture is that's one reason to think about institutionalizing this. I think that one way to know whether or not proactive disclosure is working is whether that number of requests goes down. And to the extent that every other industry has pushed more work onto the consumer, my grocery store makes me check out by myself, my plane tickets I have to do by myself. So the idea is that the more indexes to records and the more ways that you can give the finding of records available to the public, hopefully the fewer records requests you will get and the difficulty of those records requests would go down. So I don't think any of us are arguing for, diverting. I think FOIA will always be necessary. You can't always anticipate, but I think the goal of this idea of the floor and some of the information reviews, and when you build new systems, you build them so that confidential information is segregated from non-confidential information. That kind of thing, we hope, would make both the administration of FOIA, when it's necessary, cheaper and reduce the number of FOIA requests in the first place. And I do think it's an investment throughout the agency, not just in the FOIA office. And frankly, openness is part of the mission. And I think that that's another issue that does have to be dealt with, that when people in subject matter agencies are working with records, some training might remind them that part of their mission is to be open and accessible.
What she said plus.
No, I knew it was bad to have us both on the same panel.
What I want to do is make Will the loneliest guy in town. I mean, that's the objective.
That would be the goal.
And it seems to me, Peter, that in this environment of austere budget situations, it actually makes the argument for this proactive dissemination because it's more cost effective. I also think the notion is we need to be smarter on how we do the kind of agency websites and so forth. I happen to have built a website called Fed Spending. The estimate by government was somewhere between 5 and 15 million to build it over roughly 5 years. We did it in 6 months for $200,000. Now, admittedly, we're cheaper than a lot of folks, but there's a big disparity between 200,000 and 5 million and 15 million. We can do this better, quicker, and cheaper, and the first step is to make sure that we have an index of information holdings that the agencies have and put that online. That's a first step. Now, having said that, I also, Peter, want to say that it is more complex than just the culture within the government. We on the outside contribute to problems. I'll castigate media. There's a gotcha mentality. When have you seen stories about the administration doing good things on transparency? It's almost always when they screw up. And there will always be screw-ups. The advocates. We never are satisfied. We will always demand more, putting more pressure on government. The bottom line is the federal employee gets no credit ever. Not in the sense of staff reviews through the personnel process, not in rewards for other kinds of things. They only get burned when something bad happens. So the kind of culture is also something that is much bigger than just a budgetary issue or a FOIA issue. It is a whole system that we have to acknowledge exists.
Okay, I saw that there were quite a lot of questions, and so maybe I will ask people to actually move to the aisles if you've got, and stand in line, and that way we'll be able to get through more of them. So who has questions? You want to move to the aisle and approach the mic instead of waiting for the mic to come to you? Please. And there's another mic on this side if anybody wants to line up over here. Okay, great, thank you.
Hi, Robert Benincasa with NPR. To what extent is there a model in federal agencies that is actually based on saving money through proactive release and through putting things that were already FOIA'd online instead of spending money in the technical FOIA review process?
I know of one at EPA
That's what I was going to use.
when they decided to take a look at the Open Government Directive, and Gary may know the story slightly in better detail than I do, but they looked at what their requests were and found that a huge number were people doing research into properties they were about to buy or sell. And so they put all of that information online so that you can now look up information that you need to sell your property in terms of pollutants that might be there and hazards. And I think they reduced their FOIA logs tremendously. I think you know this a little better than me.
Well, I was going to even start with the Toxics Release Inventory, which started in the 1980s. Here is a law that had a result in huge savings because A, you didn't have to FOIA the request anymore. You could go online and get it. And secondly, it had the benefit of reducing pollution in our communities, which is another kind of cost estimate. I would also say the other one that strikes me that the president got right is January 18th, he did a memo to call for regulatory disclosure of regulatory compliance activities. It's actually compliance and enforcement activities. Imagine if we had had that data prior to the BP disaster, or prior to Massey Energy mine collapse, or prior to food safety problems. The kinds of cost savings go well beyond just agency, go really to public savings that are probably inestimable.
Okay, great. This question over here.
Laura Richards, Commodity Futures Trading Commission. How do you reconcile increased proactive disclosure and increased efficiency with the holder guidelines directives to make more Exemption 5 documents readily available? Because that's our biggest, I guess, time-consuming change in FOIA, and we're letting more out, but it takes a lot of document-by-document review, especially with emails.
I think that to take a first shot at that, that's been one of the matters of semantics that we've been dealing with, is what do we mean by proactive disclosure? And you're talking about a proactive disclosure of what maybe in the past might have been withheld under the B5 exemption. And the Attorney General's memorandum is encouraging us to make proactive disclosures of that type of information. And then that type of disclosure is strictly a FOIA matter, which gets confused or melded into a proactive disclosure made under open government, which would be a document that has not been processed or asked for under the FOIA and is made available to the public. And so in your scenario, yes, we are all very aware of the holder guidelines, and we are releasing more and more. And that is a proactive disclosure. It's just not a proactive disclosure of the open government kind.
Right. It's really looking more carefully at what you might have perhaps without too much reflection withheld previously, and looking at it and saying, yes, we could technically withhold this under an exemption. Do we need to? Do we want to? Couldn't we let this go without causing any harm? So I guess in a sense it's having to spend a little bit more time reviewing, but ultimately disclosing more and making that process perhaps a little more comfortable for everybody.
I've got to say, as the consumer, if you will, the user, I feel a little like a ping pong ball being batted back and forth from one administration to the next. You know, you had a previous administration put out a memo, commonly called the Ashcroft memo or the Andrew Card memo, that talked about use exemptions 2 and 5, which are largely the discretionary ones, to withhold information, they'll back you. Then you come into this administration and it's the other way, a slam back. We want you to disclose under 2 and 5. It seems to me that it's artificial to be thinking of things either in terms of FOIA or open government. We've got to talk about public access. And while I agree with Miriam 99.9% of the time, I would disagree with you. I think FOIA is an anachronism. It's a paper law in an electronic era. It is a law with a fundamentally wrong principle for today's need. It puts the pressure on the public to go request information instead of the government having the affirmative obligation to disseminate. I agree with you, we will always have to have FOIA and whistleblower protections as our safety net.
Yes.
But we could do much more to make FOIA the absolute last path that we have to go down instead of the first path.
And I would agree that would be a great goal. It is absolutely the least efficient way, but we're never going to be able to live in a world in which you want the government being the decision maker about what you can see or should see without being able to test that yourself. So it's not going to go away. We're going to continue to need it.
And I would guess that something like emails on a specific subject are things that we're not talking about proactive disclosure unless you're in such a newsworthy kind of environment, say on BP disaster spill or something like it, where you know that these are going to be requested. I don't know that anybody's thinking of those as saying you should have to go out and go through all of your emails and figure out which ones are disclosable. I think that's always on request.
Okay, question over here.
Alex Howard from O'Reilly Media. Thank you all for having this dialogue in a forum that's open and accessible to the public. The first question is actually a pretty simple one. What percentage of FOIA requests are actually made by the public or media? In talking to different media organizations, I've learned that a lot of them are made by the private sector. So, how does that actually break down in practice? The percentages might be different than the public might think in terms of how the law is actually being used. And the second is, I looked at the DoD's FOIA page while I was sitting here and saw that the records are more recently released in XML, a machine-readable format. One of the huge issues at the local level is that, for instance, town councils will print out the records of a public meeting and then scan them back in. And if anyone has ever tried to munge data, they know that that means you're going to have to spend incredible amounts of time getting the information out of those documents. To what extent is there a common standard towards machine-readable formats moving forward from the United States government with respect to FOIA requests?
Well, while Will is thinking about that, let me mention one of the dilemmas I think we face in the FOIA community is, what data need to be provided. There are an awful lot of data points that are required to be made to the Attorney General every year by agencies, and that information is really valuable in terms of numbers and backlogs and how long it takes to respond to requests and that sort of thing. But one thing that's not tracked is necessarily the status of the requester. So I think a lot of agencies would be very hard pressed to tell you exactly how their categories of requesters might break out. And of course it would vary a great deal. I can tell you that in our office, and of course we're just a microcosm of the whole process, these are people who, first of all, know that we exist, which we're still trying to get the word out, and who come to us for assistance. The number, and we do keep track of whether or not people are individuals, whether they're associated with the media, whether or not they're a business, and that sort of thing. And we do that because we're particularly interested in that. Our number of requesters coming to us who are associated with the media, I think somewhere around maybe 10%. So it's not a very high number, but I'm not sure that most agencies would even be able to tell you how that breaks out. Will?
And I can give you a rough estimate, and a lot of it depends on, to go back to an age-old FOIA question, what's your definition of news media? Under FOIA law or under reporter's law? You know, I don't know, but we have to go by what's news media under the FOIA. And the great majority of requests that we receive in the Department of Defense and probably elsewhere within the government does come from what is defined as news media under the Freedom of Information Act as organizations that have the ability to disseminate information and make editorial comments on it. And if I had to get a real rough breakdown, it would be about 70% from standard news media and other news media as classified under the FOIA, about 20% from commercial organizations, and then probably only about 10% from the public. To address the second question, the only standard for readable formats that I know of is those that we have to put in for our reports, which are put on our website in a standardized format to enable more public access and better use. As I mentioned before, we are working on search engine methodology, and we're probably going to have to rescan a lot of our documents that we've already put up to make them more searchable in an OCR format. I hope that helps with that question.
And I just wanted to add, I mean, there is a lot of discussion about open format data, but I'd like to make a distinction between data and records. And the problem is that I don't know that it's reasonable to expect that an agency would take a record that they already have and then turn it into something it never was. And so I'm just as concerned about this idea of the fake records as I am about machine-readable open source. And I think, you know, there are certain record systems that are perfectly capable of producing something directly from them that are open source and machine readable, and others that really aren't. The practice of printing things out, redacting them, and rescanning them, I hope will go away someday, but I understand that many FOIA offices are very reluctant to use redaction software because they have gotten burned by it in the past where people have been able to read behind it. And I don't know whether they didn't use it, actual redaction software, they just crossed it out in Adobe or something, but you know, they do feel quite nervous about that, and the practice has always been redact, make a copy, send the copy to make sure that you can never unredact. And I think that maybe that's a role that maybe the archives can help with in terms of at least not getting to that point. But I hope our technology panel later on might address this too.
Could I just tack on? I think, Alex, we've all talked about content standards today. Alex is raising the machine-readable standards, whether it's XML or XBRL or some format. But I would also say we need, I'll loosely call it, mashup standards. You know, the notion that we don't have common identifiers for entities makes it virtually impossible to link data sets. And until we build those building blocks, we're never going to get to the point of, say, linking spending data with performance data, which is really ultimately what the public wants to know. Are the dollars being used wisely? That's one example. So, or we will never know whether SCAF are getting government money because we can't link regulatory data sets with the spending data sets. So this is a challenge, I think, in creating the right kinds of standards, but this is hard work. This is, you know, this is not, you know, it's not news story worthy. It's not going to be the front page of the Washington Post.
Pretty boring.
Well, we're coming towards the end of the time, and I wanted to give you one last chance to identify what we should all be doing next. And maybe we'll go in the reverse order of the presentations, and perhaps Miriam, you would start, and we'll go down the line.
Well, I am going to be really interested to hear what the other panels say, and I am particularly interested in hearing about ideas for how technology can improve the process, whether it's processing, whether it's looking for standards that can be used across agencies. In fact, Gary, I think you're right. There's a great difficulty even with interoperability within agencies, much less across agencies, and particularly looking at something that can be really useful to the public as well as to the agency operations. So I'm hoping we'll hear more about that today.
for me, pretty simple. Let's get together and let's continue to get together and let's find out what you really want. And let's get away from give me everything on everything. Because that's not leading anywhere.
And I guess what I'd like to get back to is this idea of trying to build into record systems that do exist, ways of indexing them and providing those indexes to the public so we can actually tell you what it is we want without asking for everything. I think there are ways that indexes to record systems become the most efficient way to work through it. I know in some of my own FOIA requests, I'll talk with the FOIA officer and they say, look, you've asked for all the congressional correspondence. Is it okay if I send you a list of all of our control correspondence and you can pick out what you want? That's a lot easier. And if somebody will work with us to do that, I think that we can save a lot of money and time.
Whether you look at openness, access to records as a glass half empty or half full, I think that we should seize the opportunity of the President's philosophy about governing, which is transparency, participation, collaboration, to create new kinds of dialogue, new kinds of opportunity to work together. I think the only way we're going to see change is when the advocacy community, the media community, and those working in government work hand in hand to really do something. All of us will have to give a little bit, but I think we're all prepared to do it to get a better, more open, more transparent government, and one that we start to build trust in our government once again. That's what I want.
Okay, thank you very much.